In the previous part of this video I put together some pieces of armour using a technique called cold casting, which involves mixing metal powders with resin to get a metallic finish. Now, as you've just seen, I've actually finished the armour now and have summoned the forces of darkness. So in this video I'm going to go through how I got to that point. So what I now need is a shoulder pad, and I had every intention of coming down to the workshop, building this out of foam, adding fiberglass, moving it down with car body filler, same process I used before.
But while I was down there, I suddenly noticed a cast that I'd made for one of my previous projects for last year at the Asylum, which is this helmet. I actually started looking at it and thinking, well, actually the head portion of that actually kind of looks more or less the right shape for a shoulder pad. So I thought, well, why not? So I grabbed that, and I'm cutting off the face portion of this. And as luck would have it, that seems to fit pretty well. So that saved me a good few hours of work, so that was quite useful. So I've given that a layer of undercoat, and I've also added some plastic strips to the edges to give myself a nice sharp edge. I've mentioned previously that my fiancée is a tattoo artist, so she's pretty good at drawing, so I've just got her to sketch in a ram skull for me on there. So I've got a guide as to where to sculpt. So I thought I'm going to continue my skull motif here, but this time around I'm not going to do a human skull, I'm going to do a ram skull. They just look really, really cool, so I think you can't really go wrong if you include one of those in a project. So what I decided to do is do a ram skull, but keep my same motif of tentacles coming through and grabbing it from behind. So that's the basic concept that I'm working with. This time around I'm using Chevant oil clay rather than monster clay, simply because this is going to be quite a large sculpture and I've got quite a lot of Chevant sitting around in boxes, so that seemed the better choice of monster clay in this instance. A few Christmases ago I bought my fiancée a ram skull. It's very useful for her for when she's designing tattoos, and also a really cool reference for me as well, so I do occasionally borrow it if I'm working on something like this. That's what I've done here. In order to make the Chevant easier to work with, what I typically do is put it in the oven for about 20 minutes at about 60 degrees centigrade, something like that. That just makes it nice and soft but not too hot to handle.
I find that's really good for coming up with a basic shape, but once you've got your forms in place, a sort of basic shape of the sculpture, I find it easy to allow the clay to cool down, so then you've got a solid foundation to sculpt against. Now, one thing I always find with this sort of thing is that I like to have it asymmetrical, so I've got tentacles coming up from behind, gripping the skull, but I'm not trying to be super symmetrical. Sometimes that might be appropriate, and for a while I did think maybe this should be a bit more like a motif, a bit like a logo perhaps. That's a perfectly legitimate way to go, but I've always liked the slightly asymmetrical thing, and that does have some practical use actually, because say for example I wanted to actually have two shoulder pads. Well, if I make each side different, when I have one on either side of my body, they will look different from the front and from behind, so you can actually sort of get two pieces out of one sculpture. So there's actually a practical usage for making things asymmetrical. So I just kept adding and adding to this basically, so as you can see I've added a few more tentacles in. I've put these smaller skulls on the corner with tentacles coming out of those as well, so I just want to sort of build this up into something that's hopefully quite impressive for the armour. So I think that's looking pretty good, so I'm now ready to mould it. Now this thing actually is pretty heavy, so it's got so much Chevant oil clay on it. So what I've done here is to actually attach it to a wooden frame just to hold it in place. That way I don't have to worry about holding it myself while I'm making the mould. Now, as before, this is going to be exactly the same process, just on a slightly larger scale. So I'm building a surround around the sculpture, just gluing that in place. And then I'm putting some pieces around the edges as well, so that the silicone can't easily flow off the sculpture, and I can catch it before it drips onto the worktop. So I'm just pouring a first batch of silicone over this, and I'm slowly reintroducing it up to the top of the sculpture as it drips down. I'm also rotating the sculpture around just to try and get the whole thing covered. Right, so there's the silicone portion of the mould finished now, and as you can see this took quite a few batches to actually get this fully done. There's quite a lot of intricate detail in here, so I did take my time in getting this fully covered and making sure that it actually got into all of the details and there were no air bubbles in there. I'm slightly worried there probably are some air bubbles, but hopefully they're not too major. So now that's done, the next stage is to give it a fiberglass hardcase, which I'm doing here. And
having pulled it apart, there's my finished mould, which I think is looking pretty good. There are actually a few cavities, which maybe aren't too apparent in the picture there, a few air bubbles here and there. To be expected, this sort of thing does occasionally happen, but I think it's probably going to be okay. One thing I didn't think about actually was how I was going to get the whole thing out of the mould once I put the hard case on, because it's such an irregular shape it did actually lock together. So what I ended up doing was actually cutting the hard case in half just to get it off, but that worked well enough, so there were no major issues there. So once again, same process as before. I'm just mixing some metal powder into the resin, pouring that in, and then rotating the mould around to get the whole interior covered. This time around I didn't bother pasting any metal powder into the mould initially. I actually found that didn't make too much of a difference in the end, so I've sort of stopped doing that as part of the process. But the actual process for doing this is exactly the same, so I'm building up a layer of thin fiberglass on the interior, and then coming back and putting some higher grade stuff on the inside to give it some more strength. And one thing I did do with this, because there are some cavities and some quite intricate detail in the mould, what I actually did was to pour in some polyurethane resin, just because that stuff cures pretty quickly, so I could pour that in, hold the mould at a particular angle while it cured, and that way all of the small intricate details would be filled in. And I figured that would be a cool way of just getting some strength into those areas where I couldn't get the fiberglass directly in. And one thing I do still have is these cavities where the horns are, so what I'm thinking is I can actually squirt some expanding foam in there just to fill those in. Right, so that's now dried, so I've got it out of the mould and I'm quite happy with that. So next step is to give it the same process as the other pieces, give it a quick once over with some wire wool, and then now I'm having to go at it with the polishing wheel. And there's the finished sculpture. Yep, looking pretty good, I think. Quite happy with that. It's a nice finish, so I think once it's all together with the other pieces it should look quite good.
Now, a few people have commented on the previous videos suggesting they actually have a go at this with some shoe polish, so that's what I'm going to do here. The idea of this is it gets into the details of the sculpture and sort of provides a bit of antiquing to it, a bit of weathering. So I'm just going to give it a coat of shoe polish and let that dry a little, and then I'm going to wipe it down and give it a bit of a polish. So I'm just wiping this down with a polishing cloth, and I think that is actually adding something. The shoe polish is staying in the details of the sculpture, and that's sort of providing a bit of contrast really and a bit of weathering, so that's looking pretty good I think. So what I now need to do is to attach all of these pieces together, and I'm going to do that using some leather. If you're a regular on my channel, you'll have seen that I've done steampunk videos before looking at using leather to build various costume pieces, so I'm not going to go into the detail of what I'm doing here too much. However, the first part of this is to actually start drawing up some templates. What I need to do is to make a glove effectively out of leather, because these pieces are going to be fitting on my arm. Now, doing pieces to fit your hand can be quite tricky purely because there's so many pieces to it, so what I'm doing is cutting out some small sections here which will fit over all of the sections of my fingers. So there's the basis of how this is going to look. So I'm just marking out those shapes in the leather and cutting them out with the scalpel. Now, as you can imagine, this took a while, but here are all the pieces for my gauntlet, and I've given those a coating of leather dye and also a layer of varnish. So the way to attach these all together is to have a strip of leather down the centre, and then you can use rivets to attach them all together. Now, spacing is really the key here, so it's worth taking a bit of time to experiment and make sure these things are actually spaced correctly before you commit and start attaching them together with rivets. Now, in order to tie these together with the armour pieces that I've already made, what I've done is to make some small sculptures of skulls, and these are going to be decoration for the finger pieces, and I've done that simply by making some more moulds and using those to cold cast up some skulls. So that's what I've got here, and as you can see, these are going to attach to the fingers like this. So there we go, there's one gauntlet. Still got a lot to do here, but that's a good starting point I think. Now I mentioned in the previous video that I've got this section on the arm piece which I'd left empty to maybe put in some form of machinery or something like that, but my thinking with this piece is that it should be primarily sculptural, so I started thinking, well, what if I could have some sort of creature, some sort of Cthulhu spawn in here as well. So what I've done is to get some Perspex tube and start making a sculpture that can actually fit inside. Now my initial go turned out to be a little bit too big, so I started again, and as you can see I've got a version that fits precisely in there. So I've made a mould of that, and here's my cast version. As you can see, that fits in quite well. So now I need to paint this up, so I'm starting with adding some veins and things like that in. Now this is probably going to be green, and I'm not quite sure how much of this is actually going to show up on the final version, but I always find that it's useful to do multiple layers of paint and then slowly build them up. I find that gives a degree of realism to the paint job. Right, so there's my painted version, and as you can see that fits in the tube like this. Now I've got these two end stops, and again what I did here was to turn a piece on the lathe, glue some acorn nuts on, then make a mould. And what I've actually done here is to cold cast again, this time around though I've used aluminium powder to get a grey metallic look, and that fits onto the arm piece like that. Now I need something to hold this in place, so what I've done is to bend a piece of brass into the correct shape, so that effectively forms a bracket to hold the piece in place. Right, so attaching that together, and that's looking pretty good so far, I think. So what I also want to do is have various tubes and things, and I left space for these on the sculpture in the previous video. Now what I wanted to do initially with this was to actually have some electronics and some lights in this. So what I've got is some clear PVC tube, then I've got this braided cable overlay. So my thinking here was I can put some LEDs inside the tube, then when they're turned on they'll shine through the braided cable and basically look like power lines. Now that was the intention for a while, but actually I started thinking that because this thing's going to be worn primarily outdoors in daylight, I don't think these are really going to show up particularly. So in the end I decided not to use the LEDs, but I've stuck with the braided cable, so I think that's quite a nice look for this. So what I've done here is to take a piece of aluminium tube and turn that on the lathe just to add some additional detail to it. So this is going to fit on the underside of the sculpture here, and this is where I used some pipe when I was doing the initial sculpture to create a nice curved section. So I think that fits quite nicely under there. For the Cthulhu spawn in the tube, I actually want to fill this with water, so what I've done is to drill a small hole in the top and then squirt some water in with a syringe. It's quite interesting to see how different that looks with some water in place. So really what remains now is just to add some steampunk gizmos and gadgets to this to give it a bit of visual detail. And I was going through my box of bits and pieces and I found this pressure gauge which I bought ages back and never ended up using, so this is going to look quite good on there, I think. And what I've also got is these things, which are NO2 canisters. I've got bags and bags of these. I think people in the UK basically use them to get high, so you often find tons of these just lying about on the floor. So whenever I find them I always pick them up because they're just really useful for steampunk things. So what I did was to machine some holders effectively on the lathe and make a mould again. And what I've done is to again use some aluminium powder to cold cast these, so I've got a metallic finish. So having put all of those elements together, this is what I've come up with. So as you can see, I've added some leather strips and also used some of these cold cast skulls as well to add a bit more visual detail. The piece for the upper arm is actually from a previous project. It's been sitting around in the cupboard for years, so I thought this would be quite useful, save me a bit of time here, so that's quite cool. As you can see, I've got the shoulder pad there as well, and it's looking pretty good, and I've got some straps attaching everything together, and the pipes are attached to the upper arm as well. And there's the lower arm. Now, I initially had the fingers directly attached to it, but what I actually found was that it was easier to do the fingers separately. So I've come up with this thing here, and what it effectively is a piece of elastic on the back of the hand to which the fingers are attached. And I actually found that quite an effective way of doing it. You can see as I flex my fingers, you can see the elastic stretching. So that actually turned out to be quite a nice way of doing fingers. So I think if I ever need to do this sort of thing again, this is probably the technique I'm going to use. Now I may add a few other additional bits and pieces to the lower arm, I think, but I think all in all that's looking pretty good. So without further ado, let's get this stuff all on and see what it looks like. Now, for quite a while I was worrying this wouldn't look any good, but I'm quite pleased with the waistcoat I got, which I think goes with it quite well. And yeah, all in all I think it's looking pretty good. It's actually pretty comfortable as well. I had a really weird way of attaching the shoulder piece to my upper body when I initially tried this, but actually it turned out to be much easier. Just have one strap going directly across the chest. So once I figured out that that was the way to do it, it actually became really comfortable to wear. So yeah, I think that's it for this video. That'll probably be another one directly from the asylum. I'll be walking about Lincoln wearing this, but for the time being I think that's it. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.